Hi, everyone. Christopher Dahl here. Good to see you. Thank you so much for your patience. And at long last, I finally have an update I've been waiting for on the Planets Project. Hey, we are finally to a point where they're all completed. And I wanted to take some time and show them all to you, talk a little bit about each of the planets and the process that I went through to produce them, as it's definitely been one of the biggest challenges I've taken on, really, since I've been doing art as a business. And I'm personally very proud of how they have turned out. I'm so looking forward to seeing them in person finally when they arrive at the Tellus Museum in Georgia. And let's take a look at them now. We're going to do a little walk through the solar system. And we begin our journey through the solar system with the core of the solar system, our sun, Sol. As you can see here, I actually have 4 halves of the sun here. And the reason for that is that the museum wanted 2 hemispheres that would be placed together on their kiosks, one for each planet of the solar system, plus the sun, the asteroid Ceres, and of course Pluto. But because these are going to be in the elements, there was obviously concern that maybe over time something would happen to them. They might wear down, something might break, and they wanted a backup. So as part of the project, I was hired to produce not only 1, but 2 copies of each of the planets. So what you see here are what is essentially the front and back of the primary set and the front and back of the backup. Now, it's hard to tell on the sun whether or not there's a front or a back, because really the sun is a fairly feature-sparse ball of hot gas, basically a nuclear furnace. This was the first one I actually painted, mainly because it's one that doesn't require a lot of massive surface detailing. Really, I just had to paint it for the effect of the sun. And as you can see here, I did actually include some of the more prominent features, sunspots. Now, the sunspots on the sun will rotate along the center axis, which is why I have them somewhat configured here. However, I don't actually have a north or a south specified on this particular planet. I do on the others. But with each of these, I wanted to get a little pattern of this roiling, boiling yellows and oranges. And this is accomplished using an airbrush and a couple of different sponge stencils that allowed me to produce these almost cell-like structures on the surface. And from there, since this was going to be a fairly featureless orb, if you will, I decided to give it almost a radial gradient. So it was going to be lighter in the center and then getting to a darker orange on the edge. Thus, it looks like it's almost glowing from within. This one was relatively quick to make. And as you can see on the backside, after I'd completed painting the sunspots and the cells and the gradient, I covered it with a layer of white. One of the features of the kiosks that these are going to be installed in is that they're going to be backlit with light. So in the evenings, they'll have a nice light glow to them. And with that in mind, I had to ensure that I didn't paint it so thick that light would be blocked, if you will. So that is the sun. Next up on our tour of the solar system is the first planet closest to the sun, the rocky world, Mercury. And again, as you can see, I have 2 copies. I have a primary set, front and back, and a backup set, front and back. This one was a little unusual in that I completed the first primary version before I started work on the backup version. And as you can see, because of that, I ended up with a slight difference in color, but all the features are relatively the same. Also note that I've got a little little orange mark on the tops of these. This denotes north. So there is actually an orientation on my Mercury planet. There is, in fact, an attempt to note all the major features on Mercury. So many of the primary craters and these dark markings actually do match up with orbital maps of the surface of Mercury. Mercury's been visited several times over the last several decades by spacecraft that have mapped the surface, and as a result, we actually have a pretty good idea of all the major land formations on the planet Mercury. What I find really striking about Mercury is that its surface is a series of grays, like the moon, where when you look at them up close, they actually have a slight bit of color to them. And I feel I got closer on my primary set to that color than I did on my backup set. But overall, I'm happy with both of them. If you were to orbit Mercury today, depending on the light, you would see one or the other. There was also a little technique I used on this one that has come in very handy. There's actually a almost crater-like detail on the surface, which I accomplished using a series of different sponges to produce this texture. And when taken in total, you get the feeling of a very rocky surface of a very hot world circling close to the sun. And as with my previous one, the backs have been painted with a thin layer of white, which will help take the light that's behind it and project it in a more uniform fashion across the planet. Next on our solar system tour is the planet Venus. The second-most planet of our solar system, Venus is nearly the same diameter as the Earth, and from our best estimates, nearly the same mass, making it virtually a twin, except, of course, for the fact that Venus is shrouded by thick, heavy atmosphere and has a full-on greenhouse effect. The surface of Venus is hot enough to melt lead. It is not a hospitable place to live. And again, we have the primary and the backup, front and back halves of each. And for this particular version of Venus, I decided to reference the infrared imagery of the cloud cover of Venus, mainly because if you looked at Venus just with your naked eye in visible light, it would appear much as you would see it through a telescope. It is a featureless, nearly white ball. You might be able to make out some of the cloud tops, possibly, if you were close enough, but for the most part, it would just be a white silvery ball, and that's not very exciting. However, in the infrared, and to a different degree the ultraviolet, you get to see some of the differences in the cloud patterns themselves as they're made up of slightly different gases. You get traces of, I believe, carbon dioxide, bits of ammonia, hydrogen, of course, which is common in almost all the planets. And forgive me if I don't recall the precise chemical composition of the Venusian atmosphere. The net result in infrared is that you see these wonderful different bands. And the colors that I've selected were actually used by NASA and JPL when they released images of Venus in infrared. So it's actually makes for a beautiful gaseous world, even though it has an atmosphere that isn't really much thicker than the Earth's. It just happens to be a almost hellish place to live. Venus was also one of the first ones that I painted, mainly because it also did not have major land features. However, I did have to be very careful to position all the clouds radially, well, not radially, but across the surface, and indicate where the poles were. So it's several layers of airbrushing, and after I would airbrush in a layer, I would use a brush to break up the smooth airbrushing to indicate clouds, And I found a really nice technique that works out very well, and I have used it on nearly all of the planets, in particular the ones that had an atmosphere. Behind, of course, as with the rest of them, I have a nice white backing that will allow the light from behind to uniformly glow the Venus hemisphere from the backside when it's installed on the kiosk. And again, as you can see, this is very shiny. I realize you can see all of my gear in the reflections, and that is due to the fact that really this is just a clear hemisphere that has been painted on the inside. That means you get a nice hard surface for the rest of the planet, and hopefully will improve its longevity. So that is the planet Venus. And as we proceed through the solar system, we have reached the third planet, our home, the Earth. And the Earth is a beautiful blue ball of water and land masses and clouds, the only place in the solar system that supports life as we know it, and a lot of life. The Earth is seen here. Again, I have a primary and a backup. There is a front and the back, but the kiosks can be viewed from either side. So when I say front and back, I don't want to produce favoritism on a geopolitical sense. They are complete globes and can be viewed from both sides easily on the paths. This was probably the most challenging of the planets to paint for obvious reasons. The trickiest part for me was that I would have to paint the clouds before I embarked on painting the continents, which made it particularly difficult. I didn't want to occlude a continent. I wanted to make sure that the continents were all reasonably visible for somebody who wanted to walk up and maybe find their home. And obviously, with people from all over the world, that could really be anywhere. So usually when you see the Earth from space, the clouds would extend over all of the land masses, not just in the middle of the oceans as I've depicted them here. But this was an artistic choice I took. In a few cases, I had some cloud cover sweeping over South America, and I have perhaps possibly covered up some islands in the Caribbean. I'm sorry, folks. And I believe even one of these here, I have occluded much of Japan. So my apologies. It was, I guess you could say, a side effect of painting everything backwards. The next challenge was, of course, getting the continents to appear in their proper locations and proper size, and that is no easy feat. To do this, I went back to my prototypes when I had created a map of the planet, in this case the Earth. And as you can see here, I had printed this out as a flat piece projected onto these thin strips or gores. And if you notice, this is printed in reverse. So when I actually sat down to paint a clear sphere of the Earth, this map would nest inside of the planet. Lock it all down. As you can see, I have since removed this one, so it's not quite as tight as it was before. And then you would have a reference, not only to the continents' locations, but also their colors and their positions. So this way I could start in and knew that because I had a big field of blue here in the Pacific Ocean, that would be a good candidate for storms, which were, of course, painted backwards. Once I was happy with how the storms were placed across the Earth, then it was a matter of going in and actually painting in the individual continents, which were pretty much all done by hand with a paintbrush and an appropriate selection of colors to depict desert regions of, say, Mojave and the middle of the United States here, the forests of South America, And of course, going up into the northern regions as we get closer to the North Pole. And on this particular one, we got the tip of Africa and Spain and Gibraltar. My good friends in the UK have a ringside seat on this particular version of the Earth. So this, I'm actually very happy with how this one turned out. This is quite a jewel of the solar system, both in reality and in the depiction of them in my planet models. After I got the continents in, it was a matter then of filling in the oceans with a variety of blues. There are actually several blues involved. As you can see, it gets a little bit lighter as we get closer to the Caribbean here, as well as off the coast of Australia and into Asia and India. And then the deeper waters had a much deeper blue. And for the final, I, of course, did a white coating on the back so that they would glow beautifully in the nighttime skies at the Tellus Museum. And there's the Earth. Onward, we're to the fourth planet of the solar system, the red planet Mars. Mars has captured the imagination of scientists and writers and poets over many, many generations. Seen in the night sky, it's clearly a red dot that has moved across the heavens on its own path, which has confused many mathematicians and astronomers over many years. We now know that Mars is reasonably difficult to live on. I think the jury is still out as to whether or not there may be life trapped under the surface of Mars in the form of microbes and bacteria. With Mars, I found that it was nearly as challenging as the Earth. There are features on the surface of Mars that are as prominent to those of us that understand and recognize Mars as those on Earth. As you can see here, I've tried to indicate the valley, the Mariner Valley, whatever the Latin is actually, Valles Marineris, the largest single canyon, as we've noted, in the solar system. It is nearly the entire distance across the United States. And the Mount Olympus here, the largest volcano known in the solar system. And of course, on the north and south, we have the polar ice caps. Many of the darker areas on Mars are actually landforms that have different compositions to them. And in this particular version, I took the artistic license of depicting them a little darker than usual. And this is because in the sunlight, as someone is approaching the globes from a distance, if I kept them fairly close, they would wash out, and it would just basically look like an orange orb. And I didn't want that. So this is a little darker than what you would see on a globe of Mars, or even on photos of Mars for that matter. But all of the major landforms are depicted, and somebody could, in theory, walk up and say, Mark Watney was here. Although I think he might have been over here. Anyhow, I'm sure somebody could look that up. So this was tricky. I also used the same technique on Mars as I did on the other planets, where I made a map in reverse so that I could plot all of the major features in their accurate areas. And this has helped a great deal. In the past, I used to freehand the surface of Mars using a couple of globe apps on an iPad, and it worked out reasonably well, but I'm very happy with the accuracy of the major features on the surface of Mars in this version. And the backside of Mars, I didn't paint it with a white coating as I did on the other ones. When I did my tests against a lighted surface, I found that it was just right when I left it the lowest surface color, which is sort of a raw sienna mixed in with a little bit of white and slightly grayed out with a touch of blue. Of course, this tape mark right up here is my indication of the north pole of Mars. So when somebody affixes this onto the final structure, they know which way is up. And that is Mars. And moving on with our tour of the solar system, we stop halfway between Mars and Jupiter and visit the largest of the asteroids in the asteroid belt, Ceres. Ceres is an orb very similar to the moon, roughly, maybe it's half the size, maybe 2/3 the size of our Earth's moon, and has similar features. Its surface is covered in craters, very large craters. And Ceres is actually a fairly dark object. As we studied Ceres over the years, and our telescopes got better, we noticed that there were these very bright spots occurring at several locations across the surface of Ceres. Very mysterious. It wasn't until the Dawn spacecraft visited Ceres recently and orbited it for roughly 2 years, taking photos and measurements and scientific instrumentation to find out as much as we can about the planet. We noticed that these are ice volcanoes. So there is volcanic activity on Ceres that is producing plumes of ice. And because the surface of Ceres is very, very dark, the only way to properly photograph it would be to turn up the gain on your cameras. And as a result, in most of the photos you see of Ceres, you will see these ice volcanoes as very bright dots. And very shiny, very reflective compared to the dull, dark, almost charcoal surface of Mercury. For Ceres, it was important for me to show that it was pockmarked with many, many craters, as it has existed for millions of years in the solar system, just getting pummeled over time by collisions reshaping the surface. There were fewer surface maps. There are some accurate surface maps of Ceres, but I felt for the depiction of Ceres in the models that it was important for me to get the major elements, which would be these ice volcanoes. So those are accurately placed and given an appropriately sized crater around them where necessary. And again, we've got the primary and backup versions, a front and back for each of these, and the insides were again sprayed with white to allow for light transmission. Interestingly, I actually completed Ceres before I started on Mercury, and many of the techniques that I learned in applying the cratered look here were adapted for Mercury. Although because Mercury is a much larger world, the craters were much smaller by comparison, so you don't have the huge craters that you see here on Ceres. Someday we hope that we can maybe visit again and maybe do some surface exploration work and find out what's really going on with the ice volcanoes. But that is the asteroid Ceres. Moving on to the fourth and the largest planet of the solar system, the Jovian world, Jupiter. Jupiter was the first planet that I painted as a prototype, and it was actually the last that I completed as part of this project. As with the Earth and Mars, I had printed a surface map of the major features of Jupiter so that I could accurately depict where the cloud bands were, the great red spot, and of course where the north and south poles turn into this beautiful, oddly bluish and greenish vortex of storms. Jupiter, of course, is a planet that's mostly made up of very dense gas and features storms on the surface. They are particularly striking, as seen from the photos taken from telescopes and the various spacecraft that have explored the Jovian system and its moons. And as you can see here, I've got the primary and the backup, all painted in the same fashion. As I got towards the middle of working on these planets, I noticed that it was probably best that I work on them all at the same time. So I was able to capture them in a very similar rendition for both the primary and the backup. The colors of Jupiter are pushed a little bit more than what you would see from a regular seeing eye photograph. The colors of Jupiter are actually very, very muted, and it's, while beautiful, and you could distinguish between the different colors, I felt it was important to really make this shine, as again, it would be seen outdoors, often in the sunlight. So I wanted to make sure that the striking colors were perhaps a little bit more vibrant than what you would expect from seeing Jupiter with your own eyes if you were able to actually visit it. And this is primarily painted with a combination of airbrush and actual brushwork to depict the various storms and all their interactions with the gases across the different bands. But of course, the very important part for me was to make sure that we had the Great Red Spot and its associated smaller storms bumping into this cloud band with causing great turbulence across the surface of Jupiter. This one I backsprayed with sort of an off yellow, which acted not only as my light projection blocking, but it also helped fill in many of the details. And oftentimes you can't tell what's going to happen until you actually have finished the planet to actually see it and see it in person. I'm very happy with how Jupiter and the other planets turned out. And this one, I think, is going to definitely be leaving quite an impression on the crowds. And as we continue onward through the solar system, we come to the planet Saturn, the second largest planet in the solar system, and also similar to Jupiter, a planet made up primarily of storms and dense gas. Now, as you can see, I'm only painting the planet of Saturn itself. There will be rings attached around the outside of Saturn at the location, but the rings are actually being produced by the engineering firm who's constructing the kiosks. The hemispheres that I'm working with are 6 inches, and I am unable to produce rings that would match that size. They would have to be over 15 inches across to be properly sized to these, and unfortunately the devices that I have access to won't quite go that large in a contiguous circle. So that is actually being done and will be installed on location by the engineering firm. The tricky part for me for Saturn was that it's a very pastel colored world. The colors are very, very light, and I have tried to make sure we got the storms indicated in here. It's a little difficult to see in the oranges, and each of the different bands is depicted according to the imagery that we have. And similarly to Jupiter, I did actually push the colors somewhat, but this has been the probably lightest colored planet of the solar system set. And as with the rest of them, the backside has been filled in with a very light yellow, so that when it glows at night, it's going to shine beautifully with the rings. Something else I should note, too, is that after I actually painted the inside, there is a clear acrylic layer painted in to act as a protectant against the, well, it's going to be attached on the inside. No one's actually going to be able to touch it, but I felt it was necessary to preserve the paint. Acrylic on acrylic actually is bonded very well, so I just wanted to ensure that nothing could possibly scratch it in transit or during the application and installation. But without the rings, Saturn is merely a pastel ball of gas. The rings definitely give it its striking character and make it one of the more fascinating targets to view in the solar system. And moving on, we reach the planet Uranus. Uranus is another ball of gas similar to Jupiter and Saturn. Although it is mainly a featureless world, the photos of first photos from the Voyager probe as it went past, was actually a little disappointing to scientists. It was a bright blue, light blue ball. There was very little detail to be seen. And it wasn't until they were able to start looking at the planet in infrared and ultraviolet with ground-based telescopes, they started noticing patterns in the cloud cover. Uranus is also interesting in that it's the only planet whose axis of rotation is tilted towards the sun. So as I've depicted it here, what you're actually doing is looking down onto what would be its north or south pole. I believe, though, that this is the North Pole, which mainly faces the sun, and then its South Pole. And as you can see, I've tried to depict some cloud bands, which only really became apparent when it was shot from the Hubble Space Telescope in infrared. There are actually storms occurring across the surface of Uranus. And this one was a challenge to paint because, unlike the others, I had to do this radial pattern. So basically, to do that, I would turn it over, and it was set on a spinning wheel, and I used an airbrush to drop in each of the cloud storm formations as one would do on a potter's wheel. And then, of course, I came back through with a brush and broke some of those up, so you actually get some fascinating detail. If I didn't do that, this would basically be just a pale light blue sphere, and that wouldn't be very exciting now, would it? There are actually some color variations in the blues here. There are about 4 different blues. One of them gets closer to purple, while the other stays kind of in a pastel, almost light blue-green, and taken together makes for a very interesting depiction of this smaller gas giant, smaller than Saturn, much larger than the Earth. And that is the planet Uranus. And the next stop in the solar system, the planet Neptune. Chemically similar to the planet Uranus and nearly the same size, Neptune is also a gaseous body that may possibly have a rocky core. We don't know, although it is suspected. And unlike Uranus, Neptune is configured like the rest of the planets, so the cloud bands all go horizontally across the center of the planet. Neptune's a darker blue, a deeper, darker blue than Uranus, and there are speculations as to why that is, given that the composition of the atmosphere is relatively the same or similar. When Voyager passed by Neptune, there was a great blue storm brewing across the surface, well, the cloud tops, if you will, of Neptune. And this was a major feature on all of the original photos of Neptune. Strangely enough, Neptune has a more active rolling system of storms. Unlike Jupiter, that storm has actually gone away. Occasionally you get some darker, smaller ones and these lighter clouds of churned up gas, probably from other storm activity across Neptune. But this one mainly is an exploration in blues. And to me, it was critical to get them darker than the blues that I used in Uranus because they're 2 separate planets. And I am particularly fond of how this one turned out. I like this range of blues. And with each one, I made sure that I had the cloud bands properly aligned. They were airbrushed and then worked with a bit of a fan brush to make them look a little bit more storm-like. And like the Earth, the first thing I did on these was to actually paint in the white clouds across the surface. This one's been painted with a white backing so that it can glow nicely as well. And I still have the tape note showing which way is north. The beautiful blue planet Neptune. And technically, it is the last actual planet of the solar system, since the next object or body that we visit, Pluto, has since been relegated out of the planetary definition. And we reach Pluto, the outermost object of the solar system as depicted in my set of planetary objects. Pluto, of course, has been embroiled in controversy over the years. Originally discovered as the farthest planet from the solar system in the 20th century, and has since been relegated to a planetoid or large asteroid, no longer carrying the planet designation, which is unfortunate, and a lot of people are very upset about this. So the museum decided that, of course, we have to add this as perhaps the final planetary object in their displays. We didn't know a lot about Pluto up until the later part of the 20th century. We did know that it was so far away that the light from our sun would be a fraction of what we see on Earth. And Pluto has an atmosphere. We were able to detect that even before we visited it. The atmosphere can freeze to the surface depending on how far away it is. Pluto has a very oblique orbit around the sun, and sometimes it's further away and the atmosphere will freeze, and when it gets closer, the atmosphere gently releases. In 2015, the New Horizons spacecraft sped past Pluto and gave us our only views of the surface of Pluto. It was moving so fast that there was no way it would be able to slow down and orbit the planet or its moon, Charon. So the only images that we have of the Pluto surface were on this side, the front side. And what we saw was, to put it simply, amazing. The surface had a range of different colors, and each of them represented different spots where methane and nitrogen are frozen to the surface, with these giant peaks and glaciers, with the occasional evidence of craters on the surface. The colors here have been exaggerated, as they have with many of the other planets. If you were to actually view Pluto yourself from a safe distance, it would be very, very dark, and the actual colors would not be nearly as pronounced as they are here. So this has been based on a color-enhanced version of some of the best photos taken by the New Horizons spacecraft as it sped past. Now, later on, after the images were processed and returned, they managed to squeeze out a hint of what the backside of Pluto might look like. As the spacecraft went past, it turned its cameras back towards Pluto and caught just a shimmering edge of what's left of its atmosphere before it froze to the surface. And in the dark regions, with color enhancement, they were able to gain a general idea of what's happening on the backside, and interpreting it with the images they had from the front side, came up with what could probably be described as a loose approximation using the same colors. So to say that this backside of Pluto is artistic interpretation, definitely. There's a lot of artistic interpretation, but I feel that it matches fairly nicely with the front side, and it has this peculiar heart-shaped region of glaciers and ice that made for a nice view, I'm sure, at Mission Control when they got their first images back in. But because it is such a beloved world, it has been included in our list of planets. Again, the backside sprayed down with white and a little bit of a nice protective coat of clear acrylic. This is actually one of my favorite planets to paint. I've painted Pluto a number of times in different sizes, and there's just something really fun and unusual about the color scheme. This is very similar to the way I've painted it in the past in other sizes, although again, painting it in reverse order was always a bit challenging. I did actually end up using some of the map information that we had available to properly place the formations that we did see, although the one that I used was a reversed black and white map of Pluto, and this actually worked out pretty well. I'd already determined the colors that I was going to use, so really is just important for me to make sure I knew where to place them. And there we go. Pluto. This was the prototype effort that we started off with when establishing which direction we were going to go through to make the planets. Now, I had two ideas on how best to depict a planet from the inside out. And the first one I wanted to try, and I was very confident that I could do this, was to actually create a series of decals. I purchased decal film that would fit into my printer, and I grabbed some high-resolution imagery that was stitched together for the surface of Jupiter. Now, the trick here was, how do you take a flat decal and properly place it inside of a curved surface? Luckily, we've had centuries of globe makers across the world that have already figured this trick out. And the way you do this is you slice your image up into little strips here. As you can see, they are each section has been projected into a geometric shape. These are called, each of these sections are called gores. What you see here is one of them that I had taped together into a surface. So I printed the decals, we cut them all out, and then on the back, we laid the decals in onto the surface. And then at the very end, I sprayed in some white acrylic, which left me with a strangely not very accurate surface of Jupiter. As you can see, the individual sections were not aligned properly, and due to the nature of the decal printing, some of the film didn't actually work. I had attempted to use a model maker's trick of a decal setting solution to try to get the decals to sit flat. And that decal setting solution managed to get in and damage the print quality. So that was clearly a major flaw, and it's happened in a couple of places here. A couple of things about this technique. One, yes, in theory, I could produce a very accurate version of the surface of any planet using this technique, assuming I could actually line all of these up accurately. But decal film is transparent. So when you're trying to put a very transparent slab of decal onto a clear disk, you really can't see where it's sitting very well. So it was extremely difficult to do, and as you can see, it just wasn't working. I struggled with this one a little bit more than I thought, but I proceeded to finish it anyway, knowing full well that this probably wouldn't be an adequate solution. So instead, I took my next version of Jupiter and decided this one's going to be entirely hand-painted from the inside out. If I turn it over, you can see the inside paint layer. There is actually a layer of very not quite off-white, sort of an off-yellow. That's my background color to Jupiter here. And, you know, it's not the same as a Voyager or Galileo image of the surface of Jupiter, or even, for that matter, Hubble. But it's actually, the colors are really great. Now, I took some of the tricks from my decal prototype, and I crafted this map that I was showing you earlier that had all of the major features. And what I did was I took this inside of my clear sphere, and I was able to see very clearly where all of the major features were. As you can see, there are some very distinctive cloud bands that extend horizontally across the surface. This was going to be very difficult to paint onto a sphere backwards. And of course, all the major storms, the Great Red Spot, as it's been called, the giant storm of Jupiter, and all the details on the poles. So I took this, and now obviously I had to paint on the inside. So instead, I actually ran some graphic tape over the major features. And with the graphic tape in place, I could then turn it over and see very specifically where the Great Red Spot was, where the major cloud bands were, and from there, and I even taped off where the beginnings of the poles were. And what you see here is a combination of hand painting with a brush and airbrush zones that have been buffed and damaged with a paintbrush. And the whole time I was doing this, I was looking at it going, it's not looking like Jupiter. It's not looking like Jupiter. Oh my God, it's not looking like Jupiter. But when I finally did the back spray pattern of this light yellow color, all of these details suddenly appeared. And I was very happy with the final results. And the museum was as well. So we determined very quickly that decals weren't going to work. This is going to be a hand-painted effort for all of them. Now, as you can also see, these hemispheres still had the lip on them. This would be so you could drill it into a position and stick a security camera behind it. These would have to all be removed for the final planets. And that was sort of step one. Once I had collected enough of these hemispheres, all of the same type and all of the same size, I'd have to remove this flange around each of them. But the prototype efforts sold up well. These have held up very well. These have been in the sun, both of them, and they've been in the rain, and I'm happy to report they've held up very, very well. We've had some hot summers here in the Seattle area, so I was able to actually get them out into the elements to see how they would perform. And I'm very happy to report that both the decal one and the painted one have held up nicely. The paints that I've used were the golden fluid acrylics for airbrushes, because they can be hand painted and they can be airbrushed. And all of them are professional grade, very light, fast colors. In fact, the only one that I wasn't able to use, apparently, their ultramarine blue is considered not light fast. It would actually bleach out over time when exposed to the sun. So I swapped out ultramarine blue for cerulean blue, and then had a whole bunch of other colors for each of the planets. So that's the prototypes. So the Tellus Science Museum contacted me early in 2022 looking for somebody who could make planet models for them. As it turns out, not many people make planet models. It's pretty tricky to paint planets on a flat surface alone, much more so when you're trying to paint them onto a curved surface like a hemisphere or a full sphere. I'd previously been making them just because I'm a crazy artist and I really just wanted to have some planets of my own. And I had sold them to a few people. They're on my website. I've shared them around. So I imagine when the Tellus Museum started looking for somebody who could do this, I'm probably one of the few people that showed up as somebody who could actually paint planets. Now, granted, there are other companies that make planet models, but they do it for retail. They don't necessarily do them for museum displays. So I was thrilled when they contacted me. I actually couldn't believe it. I really thought, is this a scam email? What's going on? No one ever contacts me for this sort of thing. But I will say that the folks both at Tellus and the engineering design firm that they've contracted with to build the kiosk display for these planets have been awesome to work with. Of planets using a couple of different techniques, and we sorted out the details of what they wanted. And at first I thought these were going to be planets like the ones I've done before, where I painted them on the outside. But no, due to the nature of an outdoor kiosk display, paint on an acrylic sphere, even with a good clear coat, sitting out in the sun in Georgia in the elements, that really wasn't going to work out very well. So we've decided, and this is a group effort, that probably the best solution would be to secure acrylic spheres. They were all 6 inches in diameter, and they're hardened, so they're very good under the weather conditions we'd be facing, and they're actually really pretty tough. These hemispheres are actually used for security cameras outdoors, so we know that they've been tested in various elements. The trick is, to make them the protective element, I had to paint the planets on the inside of the hemispheres. Now, this isn't something I've ever done before, and to be honest with you, I was a little terrified. It wasn't even my first effort. I had tried to do some high-resolution decals using decal film that would print on the inside. And I'll show you the test here in just a minute, but that didn't work so well. So ultimately, we came up with the plan that these planets would all be painted by hand and using an airbrush, and they would be painted from the inside out. Now, that means I had to reverse order each planet painting operation, which is a little terrifying because, honestly, some of the planets are relatively easy to paint. I can think of Uranus and Venus, for example, which are cloudy planets. I was confident I could do that just fine. But when you get to, like, say, the Earth, where you have to deal with continents and oceans and a layer of cloud cover, it means you have to paint these all in reverse and accurately, because obviously most of us know what the continents of the Earth look like to a reasonable degree of accuracy. I was going to be required to match that in reverse order. So, of course, being the daring artist that I am, I said, yes, of course I could do that. Absolutely. It's going to be great. It's going to be easy. Granted, it took a little bit longer than what I had anticipated. I believe that the folks at Tellus Museum had, in their own planning, also made the same assumption. So we went beyond the first date, unfortunately, but I can honestly say that the original date that we'd planned, which was mid-November, I have actually finished all of them. So this is going to be pretty exciting.